Hello, and welcome to our lecture on understanding equity. So when you hear people talk about the concept of equity when you're playing poker, what they're talking about is pot equity, and it's usually referred to as just equity. So what is it? Well, equity or pot equity is our share of the pot if the hand is played to showdown. So if you're playing in a hand versus a single opponent, it's your share of the pot over the long run. And it's based upon the odds, meaning how often you will win the hand. And it can be expressed as either a percentage or a dollar amount. So let's go ahead and really talk about it with some really basic examples. So let's do a coin flip example. So with the coin flip example, where it's either heads or tails, you expect to win 50% of the time, right? When you flip and you're saying that you select tails, over the long run you expect for tails to hit 50% of the time. Therefore, you have 50% equity, aka 50% chance of winning over the long run. So, if you wager $1 on a coin flip, you expect to win 50 cents. Your equity, again, is 50% of that $1, because remember, you only expect to win 50% of the time. So you only, in terms of the equity, you only, are expecting to get back 50% of that for any single wager. So your equity in that is 50 cents. Simple enough? Let's do a simple poker example. So let's say you have jacks, you have pair of jacks, and you're all in pre-flop versus somebody that has ace-king pre-flop, and the pot's $100. Well, jacks expect to win 55% of the time against ace-king, so you are a favorite getting all in against ace-king with pocket jacks. So your equity is 55% of that pot. So you have a 55% equity share of the pot. And to find out what that is in terms of the dollar amount, since you're both all in, over the long run, if he puts $50 into the pot, you put $50 in the pot, the total pot size is $100, you expect to win $55 on the average. Whereas ace-king, because ace-king only expects to win $45 on the average, ace-king's going to win $45 because it's 45% equity. So you expect to make a $5 profit over the long run. If you had jack-jack and your opponent had jack-jack, right, you guys are pretty much coin flipping. You are both a 50-50, so it's pretty much break even. But with the 55% equity, you are a favorite over ace-king. So hopefully that makes sense. And if not, feel free to reach out to me and hopefully I can elaborate further. So why is equity important? Well, before we make a call, we raise, or we fold in a hand, we really need to know from a rough estimate what our pot equity share is in that hand. And it's always going to be an estimate because you never 100% know what your opponent has unless you have, of course, the pure nuts. If you flop a straight flush, you always expect to win 100% of the time, but that's very rare. We're always in a situation where we're either drawing or we have the best hand, but we're not going to win all the time. So we want to know what our equity share of the pot is before we make a decision. And we base it upon pot odds we're being offered and implied odds of potentially making the best hand on later straights. So specifically when you have the worst hand, or you're assuming you potentially have the worst hand, you're basing your decision based upon pot odds, implied odds, and looking at the mathematics behind that. And we're going to talk about that in detail, so don't worry about that right now. I just really want to introduce that concept as to why this is important. And what we're doing is we're using all this information along with the player opponent stats to make reads on them to help us make a better decision at the table. So how do we determine our equity if we are certain we do not have the best hand? Well, we counter outs. And I'm going to talk about that in a future lecture. And there's a really easy way to counter outs and then estimate our equity at the table in a matter of seconds. So now let's talk about some common pre-flop equity situations. And we're going to take a look at two different hands and compare them. We're going to look at an overpair versus an underpair, specifically aces versus queens. And we're going to look at overcards versus a pair, specifically ace king versus tens. We're going to look at a dominated hand, king queen versus king jack, where king queen has king jack dominated because of the kicker. We're also going to look at overcards versus undercards, and we're going to see who's the favorite and who's not the favorite and what the equity of these hands are versus one another. And I'll go ahead and pull up Equilab to do that. So give me 1 second. I'm going to pause the video and I'll be back in 1 second. Okay, so I have PokerStrategy.com's Equilab software open, and what this software is going to allow me to do is to input hands and to evaluate who's the favorite and who's not the favorite. So let's go ahead and put pocket aces in. So actually I'll just do ace ace. You can either use this to select specific hands, or you can type it in yourself. So one player has pocket aces, another player has pocket queens. Let's go ahead and evaluate them. What you'll notice is that pocket aces are an 81.55% favorite, pocket queens are an 18.45% favorite. And let me go ahead and slide that out of the way. So ace ace is an 81.55% favorite versus queen queen, which is an 18.45% favorite. So with pocket aces, if you get all in pre-flop versus pocket queens, you expect to win 81.55% of the time. So if the pot's $100, you expect to win $81.55 on the average over the long run, versus pocket queens expects to win $18.45 on the average. So what you'll notice is that, right, this is a winning wager in the long run, this is a losing wager. Let's go ahead and look at ace king versus pocket tens. And pocket tens is a 56.17% favorite, while pocket kings is a 43.84 favorite. So I'll just go ahead and put tens in here, 56.1% favorite. So pocket tens expects to beat ace king 56.1.7% time. Let's do king queen versus king jack. If you have king queen versus your opponent has king jack, you expect to win 73.16% of the time, while king jack only expects to win a measly 26.84% of the time. And that's because of the kicker situation, because with king queen, you put king jack in a reverse implied odds type of situation where they're constantly going to be outkicked, and it's going to cost them a lot of money. Now let's look at another situation. Let's look at Jack 10 versus 6-8, overcards versus undercards. And what you'll notice is that overcards are a 65.69% favorite. So we'll just put Jack 10, 69.69% favorite. And so I wanted to do this quick exercise with you with this software here to show you how to quickly determine your equities when you're doing hand analyses off the table. So say for example you played a hand and you wanted to see, you know, after the fact, you know what your opponent had, you want to see what your equity was. Let's say if you got all in pre-flop or if you got all in on the turn, you can go ahead and put that information in. And you can also in here, while I have it open, you can actually put the flop in. Let's say this was the flop, ace king queen of clubs, the turn was a 10 of diamonds, and the river was a deuce of hearts. You can evaluate the equity. You can actually evaluate the equity on each street, so you can evaluate your equity on the flop. You can put any turn card that you want here, evaluate it on the turn, and then the same thing for the river. So this is a great way to evaluate your equity on all streets: pre-flop, flop, the turn, and the river, with your card versus other cards or ranges of cards. And I'm not going to go into details on how to use Equilab, but if you're interested in that, definitely let me know. The most important thing to get out of this is that you can use this to determine what your equity is against a specific hand. So that's going to go ahead and conclude this lecture. We talked about looking at equity in general. So we talked about, well, what is equity and why is it important, And we also talked about how you could quickly calculate it with PokerStrategy.com's Equilab software. If you have any questions on anything I covered in this lecture, definitely let me know. If not, thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next lecture.